Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
You wanted to know about the impacts of those sanctions against Russia. And, well, we've got a fascinating deep dive for you today that goes way beyond the headlines. We're going to be looking at some excerpts from a firsthand account, originally written in Spanish,
Oh,
that really focuses on how the airline industry got caught in the economic crossfire
yeah.
between Russia and the West.
It's a fascinating look at the unintended consequences
Right.
of what seemed like at the time a pretty straightforward move. Europe closing its airspace to Russian planes. I mean, it set off this whole chain reaction that had some really surprising winners and losers.
Yeah, so Europe wanted to put the pressure on Russia after the invasion of Ukraine. It seemed like, going after their airlines would be a pretty major blow.
Logically, it makes sense.
Yeah.
But sanctions are rarely a one-way street,
Oh.
and Russia was very quick to retaliate. They banned European airlines from their airspace. And on paper, that sounds fair, right? Like a tit for tat.
Yeah, even see it.
But the economic realities were anything but symmetrical.
Yeah, and that's where this source material gets really interesting. It highlights how the airspace closures really created a domino effect, especially for European airlines that were flying to Asia.
Right.
Suddenly, they're forced to take these much longer routes, which means they're burning more fuel, they're dealing with crew overtime, they're adding layovers, and all of this adds up to major cost increases for these airlines.
Exactly. And we're talking about, a flight from Helsinki to Beijing, for example, became 3,200 kilometers longer for European airlines. So you can imagine what that does to ticket prices, travel times, and ultimately passenger satisfaction.
So European airlines are struggling to stay afloat.
Yeah.
But meanwhile, Asian carriers, and especially the ones in China who stayed neutral during this whole conflict, they essentially got a free pass. They could still use Russian airspace.
Right.
So they maintained their shorter routes, kept their costs low, and ultimately had a pretty big competitive edge.
And what we see here is this fundamental principle of sanctions, the importance of thinking ahead, right? Anticipating second and third order effects. You can't just look at the target of the sanctions and consider that impact.
Right.
You really have to think about what's going to happen as the ripples go out through the whole system.
And that's exactly what happened, as our source points out. European airlines, they started canceling routes left and right. Warsaw to Beijing, gone. Copenhagen to Shanghai, suspended. Frankfurt to Beijing, canceled.
It's like a slow motion train wreck.
It really is. Meanwhile, Asian airlines, they seize the opportunity, they add more flights, they expand their networks, they fill that void.
Filling the void.
It's just incredible how this seemingly targeted action can have these unintended consequences that really nobody could predicted.
And it doesn't even end there. Some European airlines started calling for a ban on Asian airlines using Russian airspace.
Wait, so they hurt themselves with a poorly thought out move, and now they want to penalize those who didn't make the same mistake.
The argument is that it's unfair competition.
Oh, okay.
That Asian airlines have this unearned advantage.
Interesting.
By not playing along with the sanctions.
Yeah.
But this raises some really complex questions about protectionism versus free market principles. Should governments intervene to protect their industries, even if it means potentially violating international agreements or hindering competition? It's a classic dilemma, and this case just brings it front and center.
Yeah, it really does.
It's fascinating.
Yeah. This whole situation with the airlines, it really shows how everything's connected in the global economy.
It does.
And like one seemingly small thing can have ripple effects everywhere.
Totally.
And you see the same kind of thing unfolding if we look at energy, but with way higher stakes.
Right, because unlike the U.S., which wasn't as reliant on Russia for energy, the EU had become heavily dependent, especially on Russian gas and oil. Yeah, and that dependence was built up over decades. It wasn't an accident. They needed reliable and affordable energy. Plus, there's all that pipeline infrastructure connecting Russia to Europe.
Right.
And let's be honest, there was some political maneuvering going on, too.
So when the U.S. started putting sanctions on Russian energy, the EU was stuck.
Oh, totally. They were between a rock and a hard place, right? They wanted to show a united front with the U.S., but they knew sanctioning their main energy supplier would really hurt their economies.
And the U.S., they kind of knew what they were doing. Right. They'd been careful with their own sanctions, so it wouldn't hurt their economy as much.
They knew they could step in, yeah.
Yeah.
They're a major energy producer, especially with that liquefied natural gas, the LNG.
And that's exactly what happened.
Yeah,
The EU is scrambling to find other gas sources, and the U.S. is right there, ready to fill the gap, but at a much higher price.
of course.
American LNG exports to Europe just skyrocketed, and U.S. energy companies, well, they made a lot of money.
It was a smart move geopolitically for the U.S., you got to give them that.
Right.
They took advantage of the situation, boosted their own energy dominance, and weakened Russia's hold on Europe all at the same time.
But it was European businesses and consumers who paid the price.
Oh, absolutely.
Energy prices went through the roof. We saw an energy crisis. Inflation went crazy. Industrial production suffered, and households were strained.
It showed just how risky it is to rely too heavily on one supplier, especially one that's shown it'll use energy as a political weapon.
This whole thing raises some serious questions about the future of energy security in Europe.
Right. What will they do? Will they diversify their sources, invest more in renewables, rethink those energy relationships? These are huge decisions that will shape Europe's economic and political landscape for years to come.
And it's not just energy. The source also talks about how the sanctions on Russian banks and financial institutions really mess things up for global trade and finance.
Oh, absolutely. Those sanctions messed with established payment systems, created uncertainty in the markets, and made it way harder for businesses to do any transactions with Russia.
Right.
And those effects rippled through the global economy, especially in sectors that were heavily reliant on Russian imports or exports.
It's like the sanctions created this whole parallel economic reality.
Yeah.
Businesses had to figure out this crazy web of restrictions, find new suppliers, and basically rebuild their whole supply chains, which often cost a fortune.
And the consequences weren't always clear or felt equally. Some industries and countries got hit harder than others, depending on how much they were exposed to the Russian market and how well they could adapt.
It makes you realize how fragile the global economic ecosystem is.
It is fragile.
One disruption, one unforeseen consequence, and the whole thing can start to wobble.
And there's more. The source points out this rather unexpected consequence of the sanctions that really gets into the ethical side of things, the potential for unintended harm.
Intriguing. What are we talking about here?
Well, as the economic pressure on Russia grew, their government started looking for ways to get around those sanctions. They needed to get vital goods and technologies somehow.
So where'd they turn?
To those who operate in the gray areas, countries and companies willing to profit from the situation, even if it meant undermining the whole sanctions regime. And sometimes this meant dealing with actors who have a pretty bad track record on human rights, or those who just operate outside of the rules.
So by trying to squeeze Russia, the sanctions actually created a market for illegal activities and gave power to some bad players.
It's a complicated issue, no easy answers. On one hand, sanctions are often seen as a necessary tool to put pressure on regimes that violate international law or do harmful things. But on the other hand, they can create these perverse incentives and unintended consequences that are hard to control.
It shows that even with the best intentions, there are always trade-offs and consequences to think about.
This example also raises some serious ethical questions. How do you balance holding Russia accountable with the potential harm to innocent civilians or the risk of giving bad actors more power?
Those are tough questions, no doubt. But they're crucial questions to grapple with as we navigate this messy geopolitical landscape.
Absolutely, and this brings us to another fascinating aspect of this whole thing, the rise of economic anxieties and how public support for the sanctions themselves started to erode.
That's interesting. So even with the initial show of solidarity and the widespread condemnation of Russia's actions, the economic pain started to change people's minds.
Exactly. Energy prices went up, inflation hit hard, businesses struggled, and you saw public opinion start to shift in some European countries.
So people started wondering if the sanctions were really worth the cost.
Exactly. And this was made worse by the feeling that some countries were carrying a much heavier burden than others, while some, especially those who weren't so reliant on Russian energy, seemed to be doing okay.
So it created division and resentment within Europe itself.
Exactly. And Russia's propaganda machine jumped on that, trying to exploit those divisions and paint the sanctions as a failure that was hurting Europe more than Russia.
A classic example of how economic hardship can break apart political unity and create fertile ground for populist rhetoric.
It highlights how important communication and transparency are when you're dealing with sanctions. If governments don't explain why sanctions are necessary, if they don't help their own citizens who are hurting, and if they don't address concerns about fairness, public support can vanish quickly.
That's a crucial lesson, especially as the conflict in Ukraine drags on and the economic fallout continues.
It is, and this brings us to another layer of complexity, the emergence of alternative economic alliances and partnerships.
Oh, interesting. So as the West was trying to isolate Russia, Moscow was looking elsewhere for economic and political support.
Exactly. They ramped up efforts to strengthen ties with countries that were either neutral on Ukraine or critical of the West's global dominance.
And who were some of these key partners?
While China, of course, was a major player. As the world's second-largest economy, they saw a chance to deepen economic ties with Russia, get access to those energy resources, and boost their geopolitical influence.
So the sanctions inadvertently pushed Russia and China closer together, creating a stronger economic and geopolitical bloc.
That's one way to look at it. The sanctions definitely sped up the trend of closer cooperation between those two, and that has big implications for the global balance of power.
It's a reminder that sanctions can have unexpected outcomes that go way beyond the initial target, reshaping alliances, creating opportunities for some, and adding fuel to the fire in an already tense world.
And that brings us to another interesting twist, the impact of sanctions on innovation and technological development.
Wait, sanctions impacting innovation, wouldn't they stifle it by cutting off access to resources and technology?
You'd think so, right?
Yeah.
But in some cases, sanctions can actually push countries to innovate. They create a sense of urgency and force them to become more self-reliant.
So Russia, facing these sweeping sanctions, had to come up with creative solutions to overcome those technological barriers.
Exactly. And there's evidence that this happened in areas like software development, engineering, and even the defense industry.
It's a double-edged sword then. Sanctions can limit access to existing technology, but they can also incentivize the development of new solutions and reduce dependence on foreign suppliers.
And that has interesting implications for the future. If Russia can successfully boost its own innovation and rely less on Western technology, it could come out of this with a stronger and more self-sufficient economy.
It's a reminder that sanctions aren't a magic solution.
No, they're not.
They can have unexpected consequences that can actually backfire and make the target stronger.
Absolutely. And this leads us to another layer of complexity in this whole sanctions saga, something that gets to the heart of the ethical dilemmas involved.
What are we talking about here?
Well, as those sanctions bit deeper and Russia's economy struggled, the Kremlin started looking for ways to ease the pain and find new revenue streams. One way they did this was by expanding their shadow economy.
The shadow economy. What does that even mean?
It's all the economic activity that's not officially recorded or regulated, things like informal markets, unreported income, illicit trade, criminal enterprises, all that.
So, as legitimate economic opportunities dried up, the sanctions unintentionally created a breeding ground for black markets and illegal activity.
That's a key point the source makes. The sanctions, while aimed at weakening Russia's economy, also had the side effect of pushing more activity underground, making it harder to track and control.
And that's not just bad for economic stability, it's bad for things like corruption, crime, and human rights.
Exactly. When economic activity goes underground, it often strengthens criminal networks, weakens the rule of law, and creates opportunities for exploitation and abuse.
It's a sobering thought. Sanctions, which are often presented as a way to do the right thing, can have these unintended consequences that make social problems worse and give bad actors more power.
And that brings us to another dimension of this story, one that highlights the incredible resilience and adaptability of people.
What are we talking about here?
Well, as the sanctions hit and the economic landscape changed, ordinary Russians found ways to cope and adjust.
So even with all the hardship and uncertainty, they found ways to make ends meet and navigate this new economic reality.
Exactly. They relied on informal networks, traded goods and services, used alternative payment systems, and found new ways to make a living.
It's a testament to human ingenuity, wouldn't you say? Our ability to adapt, even in the face of adversity.
It really is, and it challenges the idea that sanctions will automatically lead to a regime change or economic collapse. People are resourceful, and they often find ways to survive, even thrive, in unexpected ways.
It's a reminder that economic sanctions are not a precise tool.
They're not.
They can have unexpected consequences, both good and bad.
Absolutely. And this leads us to another fascinating aspect, how the sanctions impacted the global balance of power.
Oh, interesting. So are you saying that the sanctions against Russia, while intended to isolate and weaken it, actually shifted the geopolitical landscape in unexpected ways?
Exactly. The sanctions, combined with the West's response to the conflict, accelerated a trend that was already happening, the emergence of a multipolar world order.
Multipolar world order, what does that mean?
It means power is more spread out among multiple centers of influence instead of being concentrated in one dominant power, like it was after the Cold War when the U.S. was the top dog.
So the sanctions on Russia unintentionally contributed to a shift away from U.S. dominance and towards a more decentralized system.
That's a valid interpretation. The sanctions pushed Russia closer to China and other non-Western powers and highlighted the limits of U.S. power, speeding up that trend towards a multipolar world.
What are the implications of this shift?
Well, it's complicated and constantly changing. But some potential outcomes could be a more fragmented and unpredictable global order, increased competition and rivalry between major powers, a bigger role for regional players, and a need for new ways to govern globally in this more complex, multipolar world.
It's definitely a fascinating and challenging time to be following global affairs.
It is. This brings us to another layer of complexity: the unintended consequences for international law and institutions.
Wait. How did sanctions impact international law?
The extensive use of sanctions against Russia, especially those targeting individuals and entities, raised questions about the legal basis and due process safeguards of these measures.
So you're saying some sanctions, especially those imposed unilaterally by certain countries, may have been implemented without enough legal justification or respect for international norms.
That's a concern some legal scholars and human rights advocates have raised. They argue that the widespread use of sanctions, especially without clear legal frameworks and adequate due process protections, risks undermining the legitimacy and effectiveness of international law.
So it's a balancing act, trying to hold bad actors accountable while upholding the principles of international law and making sure sanctions aren't used unfairly or too much.
Exactly.
Right.
And that brings us to another dimension: the psychological and social impacts of sanctions.
Oh, interesting. So beyond the economic and political consequences, sanctions also have deeper impacts on people's minds and hearts.
Absolutely. Sanctions can create feelings of isolation, fear, uncertainty, and resentment among those targeted, especially ordinary citizens who feel powerless and unfairly punished.
So it's not just about the material hardship, but also the emotional and social toll.
Exactly. Sanctions can disrupt social bonds, erode trust in institutions, and fuel anxieties about the future. These psychological impacts can last a long time, shaping attitudes, behaviors, and political dynamics.
It reminds us that sanctions aren't just economic or political tools. They're social and psychological forces that can have profound and often unpredictable effects on individuals and communities.
And this brings us to another fascinating aspect, one that highlights how interconnected the global economy is and how seemingly unrelated events can be intertwined. Remember we talked about the impact of sanctions on the fertilizer market earlier?
Yes.
Well, those disruptions had a ripple effect that went way beyond just food prices.
Oh, interesting. So the fertilizer shortage caused by the sanctions actually had broader consequences for the global economy.
Exactly. One unexpected consequence was a surge in demand for natural gas.
Natural gas, what's the connection there?
Well, natural gas is a key ingredient in making nitrogen fertilizers. When the supply from Russia and Belarus was disrupted, other countries had to increase their own production to make up for it.
So they needed more natural gas to make more fertilizer.
Precisely. And this surge in demand, at a time when global energy markets were already tight because of the conflict and other factors, contributed to another spike in gas prices.
So it was like a chain reaction. The sanctions on Russia caused a fertilizer shortage, which then led to a higher demand for natural gas, pushing energy prices even higher.
Exactly. This ripple effect shows how interconnected global commodity markets are and how unpredictable the consequences can be when one part of the system is disrupted.
It reminds us that the global economy is a complex web of interdependencies, and actions taken in one part of the world can have far-reaching and unpredictable consequences elsewhere.
And that brings us to another fascinating aspect of the sanctions story, one that underscores the role of unintended consequences in shaping the course of history.
What are we talking about here?
Well, as those sanctions on Russia got tighter and the economic pressure increased, it created a sense of urgency within the Kremlin. They knew they needed to find ways to lessen the impact, strengthen their economy, and show they were resilient.
So how did they respond?
They made a series of strategic moves, some of which had unintended consequences that actually ended up helping them in the long run.
Oh, interesting. What were some of those moves?
One key move was to speed up their efforts to move away from the West and strengthen ties with other partners, especially in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. They looked for new markets for their energy exports, made new trade deals, and deepened political and security cooperation with countries that were either neutral on the Ukraine conflict or didn't like the West's global dominance.
So in a way, the sanctions, by forcing Russia to diversify its economic and political relationships, actually strengthened its position in this emerging multipolar world.
That's one interpretation. The sanctions created a sense of urgency that pushed Russia to accelerate its pivot away from the West and embrace new partnerships.
It's a reminder that sanctions can be unpredictable, sometimes pushing the target in directions that benefit them in the long run.
And another key move by Russia was to focus on import substitution, which means replacing imported goods with domestically produced ones.
So they were trying to become more self-sufficient and less reliant on imports, especially from the West.
Exactly. This push for import substitution, partly driven by necessity, also had unintended consequences that could strengthen Russia's economy in the long term.
How so?
By investing in domestic industries, promoting innovation, and developing local supply chains, Russia could reduce its vulnerability to external shocks, create new jobs, and foster a more resilient and diversified economy.
It's a reminder that adversity can sometimes drive innovation and lead to positive changes that might not have happened otherwise.
And that brings us to another fascinating aspect, one that gets to the heart of the ethical dilemmas involved.
What are we talking about?
Well, as those sanctions tightened and Russia's economy felt the squeeze, the Kremlin looked for ways to ease the pain and find new sources of revenue. One avenue they pursued was expanding their shadow economy.
The shadow economy, what is that exactly?
It's all the economic activity that's not officially recorded or regulated, things like informal markets, unreported income, illicit trade, criminal enterprises, that sort of thing.
So, as legitimate economic opportunities shrunk, the sanctions unintentionally created a breeding ground for black markets and illegal activity.
That's a key point the source makes. The sanctions, while intended to weaken Russia's economy, also pushed more economic activity underground, making it harder to track and control.
And that has implications not just for economic stability, but also for issues like corruption, crime, and human rights.
Exactly. When economic activity goes underground, it often empowers criminal networks, weakens the rule of law, and creates opportunities for exploitation and abuse.
It's a sobering reminder that sanctions, which are often presented as a righteous tool of foreign policy, can have unintended consequences that worsen social problems and empower bad actors. It's amazing how this one event, the war in Ukraine and the sanctions, has had such a widespread impact. It's affected everything from airlines to energy markets to the very structure of the global order.
It really shows how interconnected our world is. Actions taken in one part of the world can have repercussions across continents and sectors, creating a cascade of consequences that are often hard to predict or control.
And it shows the importance of thinking critically about these complex issues, recognizing the nuances, and acknowledging that there are rarely easy answers or simple solutions.
Absolutely. And this brings us to a final thought-provoking point as we wrap up our deep dive. It's about the role of narratives and perceptions in shaping the outcome of sanctions regimes.
Narratives and perceptions, what do you mean?
Well, as we've seen, sanctions aren't just about economic pressure or legal frameworks. They're also about narratives, the stories we tell ourselves and others about who's right, who's wrong, who's winning, and who's losing.
So it's not just about the material impact of sanctions, but how they're perceived and framed by different actors.
Exactly. The effectiveness of sanctions often hinges on the ability to control the narrative, shape public opinion, and rally international support.
So it's a battle for hearts and minds as much as it's a battle for economic or political leverage.
Precisely. And this is where those unintended consequences can pop up. If sanctions are seen as unfair, ineffective, or counterproductive, they can backfire and undermine the very goals they were meant to achieve.
So even if sanctions are well-intentioned and carefully planned, they can fail if they don't resonate with the public or if they're seen as serving narrow interests instead of the common good.
Exactly. And this highlights the importance of communication, transparency, and accountability in managing sanctions regimes.
It's a reminder that in our interconnected world where information flows freely and narratives can change quickly, the success or failure of sanctions often depends on factors beyond economics or politics.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the unintended consequences of sanctions. I hope this exploration has given you some insights and things to think about as you navigate this complex and ever-changing global landscape.
It certainly has for me. And to our listeners, I encourage you to keep exploring these issues, questioning assumptions, and seeking out different perspectives. The more we understand about the complexities of the world around us, the better equipped we'll be to navigate the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. It's wild how even something like airspace can become such a big deal. It seems so technical,
Right.
but it turned into a geopolitical battleground with huge economic fallout.
It did, and it's crazy that even with the pain their economies are feeling, some European airlines are pushing for even stricter rules.
Yeah, the source mentioned how some airline executives are calling for a ban on Asian airlines using Russian airspace. It's like they're saying, we made a mistake, so now everyone else has to suffer too.
Yeah, like, we shot ourselves in the foot, now you have to limp. Their argument is that it's unfair competition.
Right.
That Asian airlines have this advantage because they didn't join in on the sanctions.
But isn't that the whole point of sanctions? To create pressure. If you don't take part, you don't face the same restrictions.
Right, and that's a big part of the debate. It makes you question the whole idea of sanctions in a global economy.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you enforce them when not everyone agrees?
Right.
And can you even legally punish companies from countries that haven't imposed those same sanctions?
It seems like trying to change the rules after you've already lost.
It also highlights this tension between protecting your own industries and the idea of a free market. On the one hand, you want to help your own companies, but then that goes against free trade and could hurt consumers in the end.
Right. Less choice, higher prices.
Exactly.
So what's the bottom line for our listeners who've been with us on this deep dive? We've uncovered all these unintended consequences, the impact on airlines, the energy crisis, the ethical issues, the shifts in global power. What does it all mean?
Well, the big takeaway for me is that sanctions are a powerful tool, but you have to use them carefully and strategically.
Right, like in chess, think several moves ahead.
Exactly. You got to anticipate how the other side will react. Because as we've seen, those reactions can be unpredictable.
And you end up with outcomes that nobody saw coming.
Right. And it's not just about the economic impact. It's about understanding the whole geopolitical situation, cultural differences, psychological effects, and the potential for unintended consequences that can ripple through the whole world.
We really do live in a complex world.
We do.
Where one action can have big effects somewhere else.
Absolutely. And as things continue in Ukraine, we'll see how these sanctions play out in the long term. We've only just begun to see how they'll reshape trade, energy, and the balance of power.
It's been an eye-opening deep dive for me. I hope it has been for you too, listeners. The world is changing fast, and understanding these complex issues is more important than ever.
Keep asking those questions, stay informed, and remember that even actions that seem simple can have consequences that go far beyond what anyone intended.